There is a particular kind of silence that you only find underground. It is not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a forest at night. It is something older than either of those. Something that presses against your ears not as an absence of sound, but as a presence in itself. People who have spent time in deep underground spaces, archaeologists, spelunkers, miners, the people who have accidentally broken through into chambers that were not supposed to exist, describe it in almost identical terms, regardless of where in the world they were standing. They say the silence feels inhabited. They say it feels like something was there recently, and the quiet is what it left behind. In British Columbia, that silence is everywhere beneath your feet. This is a province that most people understand as a landscape of the visible, of mountains that cut the sky, of rivers that run cold and fast over granite beds, of forests so dense that the light reaches the ground in fragments. What is not usually part of the story of British Columbia is what lies beneath that landscape. The tunnels, the chambers, the passages cut through stone in ways that the official geology of the region cannot fully account for. The shafts sunk to depths that the tools available at the time of their supposed construction could not have achieved. The underground networks that connect points miles apart, that run beneath rivers without flooding, that open into carved chambers, whose walls bear marks that no currently recognized culture of this region is known to have made. Historians have been aware of these tunnels for a long time. The awareness has not translated into investigation. In most cases, it has translated into something closer to its opposite, into the careful reclassification of evidence, the quiet removal of inconvenient reports from accessible archives, the subtle professional pressure applied to researchers who push too hard in directions the institutions would prefer they did not go. What follows is built from the records that remain, from survey documents filed in the 1880s and 1890s that were never formally published, from letters exchanged between Hudson's Bay Company administrators that were accidentally preserved when a Winnipeg archive was consolidated in 1974, from the oral records of the Stolo Nation, the Secwepemc people, the Haida, and a dozen other indigenous communities whose accounts of the underground world beneath British Columbia have been described by mainstream historians as mythology, precisely because they are too consistent and too specific to be comfortable. We are going to read those records carefully tonight, and we are going to follow them underground. If this is the kind of history that calls to you, the buried kind, the kind that takes patience and a willingness to sit with what is uncomfortable, then stay with this channel. Every week there is something new from the records they stopped teaching. Subscribe, press the bell, and come with us into the dark. There is something you need to understand before we go any further about the geology of British Columbia and why it makes the existence of extensive underground networks both plausible and strange at the same time. British Columbia sits on one of the most geologically complex pieces of real estate on the surface of this planet. The province has been shaped by more than 300 million years of collision, subduction, volcanic activity, glaciation, and tectonic stress. What that means in practical terms is that the rock beneath British Columbia is not uniform. It is layered, fractured, folded, and in many places hollow in ways that even modern ground-penetrating surveys have only partially mapped. The karst systems of Vancouver Island, for example, the networks of limestone caverns and passages that form when acidic water moves through soluble rock over geological timescales, are among the largest and least documented in North America. The Cathedral Cave system alone, near Port Alberni, extends to a mapped length of more than 4 kilometers, with sections that remain unmapped because the passages narrow beyond what modern equipment can easily access. and Cathedral Cave is not unusual. It is simply the one with a name on the tourist brochure. Beneath the Fraser River Canyon, beneath the Thompson Plateau, beneath the floor of the Okanagan Valley, beneath the coastal mountains of the Haida Gwaii archipelago, there are natural systems of underground space that are known to exist, poorly understood, and largely unexamined in a systematic way. This is the geological background against which everything else in this story takes place. Not all of the tunnels we are going to discuss are natural, but the presence of extensive natural underground space makes the existence of modified and constructed underground space much harder to dismiss as impossible. That distinction matters, because one of the tools most consistently used to shut down investigation of British Columbia's underground anomalies is the claim that the geology simply does not permit the kind of tunneling that witnesses have described. That claim is not supported by what the geologists who actually work in the region have found. What is true is that the geology does not permit the kind of tunneling that the official history of human habitation in British Columbia would predict. Tunneling at the scale, depth, and apparent age that the records suggest. That is a very different thing. Let us begin where most investigations of this subject begin, even when they do not know they are doing so. Let us begin in Victoria. Victoria is a city that presents itself as knowable. Its downtown is compact. Its streets follow a grid established in the colonial era. Its architecture is a careful performance of 19th century English respectability that the tourism industry has maintained with considerable discipline. Hanging baskets of flowers, double-decker buses, the Empress Hotel reflected in the still water of the inner harbor. It is a city that has always been very good at showing you exactly what it wants you to see. What it does not particularly want you to see is what is underneath it. The tunnel network beneath Victoria's Chinatown, the area known historically as Fan Tan Alley and its surroundings, is one of the most documented and simultaneously most poorly understood underground systems in Canada. What most visitors to the site are told, if they are told anything at all, is that the tunnels were built by Chinese workers in the late 19th century to allow movement between buildings in a community that faced persistent violence and legal discrimination from the broader colonial society. That explanation is not false. It is incomplete in ways that, once you begin to look at the physical evidence more carefully, become difficult to ignore. The tunnels that are publicly acknowledged beneath Victoria's Chinatown are real. They exist. Some sections have been partially excavated and examined by historical preservation workers over the years. What those preservation workers have consistently noted in internal reports that do not make it into the visitor brochures is that the network they are examining is not architecturally uniform. There are sections that bear the construction signatures of the late 19th century. Specific brick types, specific mortar compositions, specific construction methods consistent with the techniques available to Chinese workers in colonial British Columbia. And then there are sections that are something else entirely. The older sections of the Victoria Underground are cut from the native rock beneath the city in a way that has no obvious historical explanation. The cuts are precise. The passages maintain a consistent height and width across distances that would require sustained coordinated excavation effort over a significant period of time. Some of the chambers that open off these passages, chambers whose existence is known to historians who work in the region and rarely discussed in any public forum, are not the size of storage rooms. They are large enough to have functioned as meeting halls. Their floors show evidence of modification. Their walls, in some locations, bear carvings that are not consistent with any identified tradition of either the indigenous cultures of the southern Vancouver Island region or with the Chinese immigrant community of the colonial era. A heritage preservation report filed with the British Columbia government in 1987, not publicly released, obtained years later through a Freedom of Information request by a researcher whose subsequent career in academic archaeology proceeded in a notably limited direction, described one of these carved chambers in terms that deserve to be read carefully. The report noted that the chamber in question appeared to predate the surrounding network of 19th century tunnels by an indeterminate period, that the method of its excavation was inconsistent with any tool tradition known to be present in the region before European contact, and that the symbols carved into its eastern wall had been photographed and submitted to 3 separate academic institutions for identification. None of the 3 institutions provided an official response to the query. 2 of them reported in informal communication that the images had been forwarded to a department specializing in pre-Columbian studies, and that no further response would be forthcoming. That report has never been publicly released in its complete form. The partial version that circulates among researchers who study this subject omits the sections dealing with the carved chamber entirely. If you compare the partial version to the complete version, which requires access to a specific private collection whose owner has requested anonymity, the omission is not accidental. The page numbers in the partial version do not run consecutively. Pages 41 through 57 of the original document do not appear in the partial version. What appears instead is a page numbering sequence that jumps from 40 to 58 as if nothing is missing. Someone removed those 17 pages. Someone did it carefully enough to renumber the remaining pages, and the work was done before the document entered any public archive, which means it was done inside the institution that produced it. This is not the only instance of this pattern in the documentary history of British Columbia's underground. It is simply the most precisely documented one, because the private collector who holds the complete version is also a retired archivist who understood what she was looking at when the document came into her possession and made the comparison deliberately. Victoria is only the beginning. The underground network that the Heritage Preservation Report was examining does not stop at the boundaries of Victoria's Chinatown. Researchers who have traced the known sections of the tunnel network using ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted informally by individuals rather than institutions, because institutional interest in this project has been difficult to secure, have identified passage signatures that extend northeast from the Chinatown area toward the James Bay neighborhood, southwest toward the waterfront, and in one anomalous case, directly beneath the harbor itself in a direction that points toward the Songhees territory on the opposite shore. An underwater tunnel passage beneath Victoria's inner harbor is not physically impossible. It is, however, considerably beyond the construction capacity of any group identified in the official historical record as having been present in the region before the 20th century. The passage signature identified by the ground penetrating radar survey is approximately 2 meters in diameter. It runs at a consistent depth of approximately 6 meters below the harbor floor. The survey operator who first identified it, a retired geophysicist from the University of Victoria, described his initial reaction in a letter to a colleague as one of confusion, followed by the quiet decision to say nothing until he had verified the reading several times. He verified it 4 times. The reading was consistent. He submitted a preliminary report to a government geological survey office and received, after 3 months, a response informing him that the signature he had identified was consistent with a natural geological feature and required no further investigation. He did not believe this explanation. The signature is not consistent with any natural geological feature he had encountered in 40 years of geophysical survey work. He said so in the letter to his colleague, in plain language. The natural feature explanation he wrote would require the existence of a perfectly cylindrical limestone tube, maintaining a consistent diameter across a horizontal distance of several hundred meters beneath a tidal harbor, with walls that show no evidence of the irregular erosion patterns characteristic of natural karst formation. He had never seen a natural formation matching that description. He did not believe one existed beneath Victoria Harbor. He died in 2009 without ever publishing his findings formally, citing, in his correspondence from the last decade of his life, a persistent difficulty in finding any institution willing to host or fund the follow-up work he believed was necessary. His papers are held by his daughter. She has made portions of them available to researchers she trusts. Let us move now from the southern tip of Vancouver Island to the canyon country of the BC interior, where the stories get older and the records get stranger. The Fraser River Canyon is one of the great geographical features of British Columbia. The river itself drops through a series of gorges cut so deep into the interior plateau that standing at the rim and looking down, you feel the scale of geological time in a way that is almost physical. The canyon walls are granite and basalt, streaked with the mineral signatures of the extraordinary geological processes that formed them. The canyon has been a travel corridor for human beings for at least 10,000 years, and the evidence of that travel, in the form of petroglyphs, fishing platforms, village sites, and the old trading trails that the first European surveyors found already worn, smoothed by millennia of use, is everywhere along its length. What is also everywhere along the length of the Fraser Canyon, in the oral traditions of the Stolo Nation, whose territory this has been for longer than any written record extends, is the knowledge of what is inside the canyon walls. Not in front of them, where the river runs, but inside them, in the rock itself. The Stolo people have maintained across generations of oral transmission accounts of passages within the canyon walls that connect the visible surface of the landscape to chambers inside the rock that function, in these accounts, as places of specific cultural and spiritual significance. The English translation of the term most commonly used to describe these places carries the sense of something like a threshold, a place where the inside of the world meets the outside of it, where what is usually invisible becomes briefly accessible. These are not described as naturally occurring caves in the way that an English speaker might understand that term. They are described as made places, places that were worked, places that were entered by specific people for specific purposes, and that were closed in ways that made them invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. Ethnographers working in Stolo territory in the late 19th and early 20th centuries recorded versions of these accounts. The most detailed documentation appears in the field notes of a government ethnographer named Charles Hill Toote, who worked extensively in the region between 1895 and 1905. Hill Toote was a complicated figure by any measure, a man whose genuine intellectual curiosity about indigenous cultures coexisted with the colonial assumptions of his era in ways that make his work simultaneously valuable and requiring careful interpretation. But he was a meticulous note-taker, and his field notebooks, held at the University of British Columbia Library, contain passages that his published work carefully omitted. In a notebook entry dated August of 1899, Hill Toote recorded a conversation with a Stolo elder whom he identifies only by an anglicized initial, a common practice in his notes, reflecting either a privacy concern or a social convention of the period. The elder, according to Hill Toote's notes, described a passage in the canyon wall approximately 4 miles below the settlement, then called Yale as one that had been in use, within his people's knowledge, for as long as anyone could trace. The passage opened into a chamber, and from the chamber there extended additional passages. Hill Toot asked whether the elder had himself entered the passage. The elder said that he had in his youth accompanied his own grandfather to the entrance and had been shown the opening. He had not himself proceeded beyond the entrance chamber because entry to the deeper portions of the system was restricted to specific individuals whose training qualified them to navigate it safely. Safe here, meaning not physical safety in the sense of structural integrity, but a different kind of safety, whose nature Hill Toot's notes acknowledge he did not fully understand. The published version of Hill Toot's work on the Stolo, which appeared in the Journal of the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland in 1902, contains no reference to this passage or the chambers associated with it. The omission is not explained. The notebook entry itself is intact. The gap between what Hill Toot recorded and what he published is a clean, deliberate editorial decision whose reasoning he did not commit to paper. What Hill Toot did commit to paper in a letter to a colleague at McGill University written in 1903 and preserved in the McGill archives was a more general observation about what he had been recording. He wrote that he had encountered in his work among several of the river peoples of the British Columbia interior a consistency of reference to underground structures that he found difficult to account for within the frameworks available to him. He noted that separate communities with no documented contact with each other, and he named 3 specific groups whose territories were not adjacent, described underground systems that bore structural similarities in their accounts, the same approximate dimensions, the same description of interior environmental conditions, the same terminology for the different sections of the underground network, the same references to specific functions served by specific chambers. He found this consistency troubling, he said, because it suggested either a common origin for these accounts that predated the separation of these communities, which would place the underground systems at an antiquity that he did not want to put in writing, or an ongoing contact between these communities that he had not been able to document and that contradicted the established understanding of their histories. He did not pursue this line of inquiry publicly. His subsequent publications made no reference to it, and the letter, sitting in the McGill archives for more than a century, was catalogued under a general correspondence heading that gave no indication of its contents. It was identified by a doctoral candidate researching something entirely different in 2008, and its significance has not yet entered any mainstream discussion of British Columbia's archaeological or historical record. Now let us go further into the canyon, because the oral records of the Stolo are not the only thing pointing at what is inside those walls. In 1858, the Fraser River Gold Rush brought tens of thousands of men into British Columbia's interior in a matter of months. It was one of the most rapid mass migrations in North American history up to that point, and it had the characteristic quality of all gold rushes. It was chaotic, poorly documented in aggregate, even as it generated enormous quantities of individual testimony, and it placed large numbers of people in remote landscapes for which they had no preparation and no cultural framework. Among those people were miners who worked the canyon itself, men who, in their efforts to reach the gold-bearing gravels along the riverbanks and in the river bottom, found themselves drilling and blasting into the canyon walls in ways that created entirely new relationships between the surface and the interior of the rock. The hydraulic mining techniques that came into widespread use in the canyon region in the early 1860s were particularly invasive in this sense. They could expose large sections of canyon wall at once, revealing what was behind the surface face of the rock. What some of those miners found behind the surface face of the rock was not supposed to be there. The most consistently reported category of anomaly in the accounts of Fraser Canyon miners from the 1860s and 1870s is the discovery of passages that were already there before the mining began. Not natural passages in the sense of unmodified geological features, but passages that showed signs of having been worked, floors that were level in ways inconsistent with natural erosion, walls that had been smoothed or shaped, openings that appeared to have been sized deliberately for human passage. These accounts appear in letters home, in the diaries that survive from this period, in the depositions filed in connection with mining claim disputes where the physical layout of a dig site was relevant to a legal question. They are not a marginal feature of the documentary record of the Fraser Canyon gold rush. They appear consistently enough across enough independent sources that dismissing them as individual delusion or exaggeration requires a level of skepticism that you would not apply to other categories of minor testimony from the same period and the same documentary sources. What happened to the passages when miners found them? In some cases, they were incorporated into the mining operation, used as access routes, expanded, modified beyond recognition. In some cases, they were sealed, either deliberately by mining companies who did not want the complications that came with anomalous discoveries, or accidentally by the mining process itself. In a few documented cases, they were reported to colonial authorities and then, in the documentary record, disappeared. The reports were received. They generated internal correspondence. And then the trail goes cold in the colonial archives in a way that is consistent, again with deliberate rather than accidental loss. There is a specific case from 1863 that illustrates this pattern precisely enough to be worth examining in detail. In the spring of that year, a mining operation working the canyon walls approximately 2 miles above the town of Hope broke through into what the mine foreman's report described as a prepared passage of considerable size. The foreman, a man named Robert Alderdice, whose name appears in several other Fraser Canyon mining documents from the same period, submitted a written report to the Colonial Mining Commission in New Westminster. The report described a passage approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet in height that extended into the canyon wall beyond the limit of the light carried by the survey party. The walls of the passage, Alderdice wrote, were smooth in a way that blast rock is not smooth, and the floor was flat in a way that he could not account for geologically. He reported that the passage showed no signs of recent use, but also no signs of the kind of gradual deterioration that would be expected in a natural formation that had been sealed and undisturbed for a long period. He requested guidance from the Commission regarding how to proceed. The Colonial Mining Commission's records for the relevant period, held in the British Columbia Archives in Victoria, contain a reference to Alderdice's report in an index of received correspondence. The report itself is not in the files. There is a notation in the index that the document was transferred to another file, identified by a reference number. That reference number does not correspond to any currently existing file in the archive. The passage Alderdice described has never been formally identified, examined, or explained. Let us move now to the Kootenay region of southeastern British Columbia, because the Kootenays tell a version of this story that is older and stranger than anything the gold rush miners stumbled into. The Kootenay region is defined geographically by the Rocky Mountain Trench, one of the longest and most dramatic linear valleys on Earth, running for nearly 1,500 kilometers along the western edge of the Rocky Mountains. The trench is the result of geological forces operating on a scale that makes ordinary landscape-forming processes look modest, and it creates a setting for human habitation that is simultaneously spectacular and logistically challenging. The communities that live in the Kootenays today are mostly small, separated by mountains and lakes, connected by roads that were not reliably all-weather until well into the 20th century. This relative isolation has been both a limitation and a kind of preservation. It means that things survive in the Kootenays in physical and documentary form that were lost elsewhere to development and institutional attention. The Ktunaxa Nation, whose territory encompasses much of the Kootenay region on both sides of what is now the Canada-United States border, have maintained oral accounts of underground systems in their territory that share structural features with the accounts recorded by Hill Toot among the Stolo. The same references to prepared passages, to chambers of specific function, to systems that extend beyond what any individual has fully explored. The Ktunaxa accounts are somewhat different in emphasis, however, in ways that reflect the specific landscape of the Rocky Mountain Trench. The Ktunaxa describe the underground systems in their territory not primarily as threshold spaces, as places where the inside and outside of the world meet, but as travel routes, passages that allowed movement between points on the surface that would otherwise be separated by mountain terrain, impassable in winter, passages that had been used for purposes ranging from trade to refuge, to the movement of specific ceremonial objects between communities that needed to maintain contact without that contact being visible to parties who might wish to interfere with it. This functional description, underground passages as travel infrastructure, becomes very interesting when you look at what the early European explorers and surveyors of the Kootenay region found and reported. David Thompson, the Northwest Company surveyor and explorer whose mapping of Western Canada in the early 19th century remains one of the great achievements of geographical documentation, passed through the Kootenay region multiple times between 1807 and 1811. Thompson's journals are extraordinarily detailed and are generally regarded as among the most reliable primary sources available for the early European encounter with the BC interior. His published narrative, the narrative of his explorations in Western America, written late in his life and first published in 1916, is the version most people who know Thompson's work have read. His original journals are in the archives of Ontario. The original journals contain passages that the published narrative does not. Among those passages are several entries dealing with what Thompson describes as trails that enter the ground. He notes these in a matter-of-fact way that suggests they were not unusual to the indigenous guides accompanying his party, that they were simply part of the known geography of the region that anyone who traveled there regularly would be expected to know. His guides, in at least two of the relevant journal entries, explained to Thompson that the underground trails allow passage beneath specific mountain ridges that would otherwise require multi-day detours in summer and were impassable in winter. Thompson does not describe entering these passages himself. He describes the locations where they begin and end on the surface, as described by his guides, with the geographical precision that characterizes all of his surveying work. The locations he describes on the surface, the entry and exit points of what his guides describe as underground passages, correspond to positions in the landscape that are, by modern mapping, approximately 12 and 15 kilometers apart respectively. If the underground passages connect these surface points directly beneath the intervening mountain ridge, they represent tunnels of considerable length. Tunnels whose construction by any method available to the peoples of the region in any period that fits the conventional archaeological timeline of British Columbia would require a level of sustained organized effort on a scale for which there is no other evidence in the region's record. Thompson's editors, preparing the narrative for its 1916 publication, omitted these journal entries. The published narrative is approximately 40% shorter than the sum of the original journals, and the editorial decisions that produced that compression were made by the Champlain Society, the historical organization that funded and oversaw the publication project. The editor's correspondence, also held in the archives of Ontario, indicates that the decision to omit the entries dealing with underground trails was made on the grounds that they could not be corroborated by other sources and might reflect misunderstanding on Thompson's part of what his guides were communicating. This is a reasonable editorial caution. It is less reasonable when you know that the same entries were omitted from all subsequent publications of Thompson's journals without any notation that an omission had occurred through a publication history that extends to the present day. If you read any currently available edition of David Thompson's journals, you will not find his references to underground trails in the Coatine region. You will not be told that they were there and were removed. You will simply find a text that does not contain them, presented as if it is complete. The region of the Coatines most densely associated with underground anomalies in both the historical and the oral record is the area around Coatine Lake, a deep, cold, remarkably clear body of water that runs for over 100 kilometers through a landscape of steep-sided mountains. The lake itself is unusual. At its deepest points, it descends to nearly 150 meters, and its floor has never been comprehensively mapped. Dive operations in Kootenay Lake are limited by the depth, the cold, and the visibility challenges created by the thermoclines in the deeper sections of the water column. What has been documented through historical fishing operations, through the accounts of the early European settlement of the lakeshore communities, and through the testimony of the Tunicsa people whose relationship with the lake extends back to a time before the last glaciation, is that the floor of Kootenay Lake connects to at least one, and possibly several, underwater passages that exit the lake through the adjacent mountain walls. These are not hypothetical. They are documented in the behavior of the lake water itself, in currents and temperature patterns, and dissolved mineral profiles that are inconsistent with a simple enclosed basin, but consistent with a body of water that has throughput connections to underground hydrological systems extending into the surrounding mountains. What those underground hydrological systems look like at human scale, whether the passages are large enough to have served as travel routes, whether they contain the carved chambers and work surfaces that appear in other parts of the BC Underground record, is a question that no institutional research program has attempted to answer. The question has been asked multiple times by multiple researchers. The institutional response has been consistent. There is no funding available for this line of investigation, and the geological explanation for the anomalous water behavior of Kootenay Lake is considered sufficiently established that further investigation is not warranted. The geological explanation that is considered sufficiently established is not publicly documented in any paper that a non-specialist can locate. The papers that cite it cite each other. Following the citation trail leads eventually to a 1962 government geological survey that classified its detailed findings and released only a summary. The summary states that the hydrological anomalies of Kootenay Lake are consistent with regional geological patterns. It does not specify which patterns. It does not describe the mechanism by which those patterns produce the observed anomalies. It is, in other words, a document that formally says nothing while occupying the space in the citation record where an explanation should be. We will come back to Kootenay Lake. First, we need to go to Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island is the largest island on the Pacific coast of North America, and it has been continuously inhabited by human beings for a period that the current archaeological consensus places at somewhere between 12 and 14,000 years. The archaeological record of Vancouver Island's surface occupation, the village sites, the middens, the carved objects, the weir structures, is rich and reasonably well documented, even accounting for the gaps introduced by a colonial history that prioritized erasure over preservation. The archaeological record of Vancouver Island's subsurface is something else entirely. The karst systems of Vancouver Island are, as noted earlier, among the most extensive in North America. What is not usually included in the general description of these systems is the degree to which some of the passages within them show evidence of modification by human hands at a period that cannot be precisely dated, but that precedes by an indeterminate margin any period of human occupation currently acknowledged in the archaeological record of the region. This is a significant claim, and it requires careful examination. The Vancouver Island cave systems have been intermittently explored by cavers since the 1960s, when organized spelunking as a recreational and scientific activity began to establish itself in the province. The Karst Research Group, a volunteer organization associated with the BC Speleological Society, has documented hundreds of cave entrances and passage systems across the island over the past 6 decades. Their published records are thorough and scientifically careful in the areas where thorough and scientifically careful recording has been applied, but the BC cave inventory is not complete, and the gaps in it are not randomly distributed. The areas of Vancouver Island where the cave inventory is most conspicuously incomplete are the areas where the oral traditions of the island's indigenous peoples, the Nu-Cha Nulth on the west coast, the Coast Salish on the east and south, the Kwak-Waka-Wakf at the island's northern end, are most specific about the existence and significance of underground spaces. This correlation is not acknowledged in any published document of the Karst Research Group or the BC Speleological Society. It is visible when you lay the geographic distribution of documented cave systems against the geographic distribution of oral tradition references to underground significance, and it is visible enough that researchers who have done this comparison have found it striking. There is a reason why the cave surveys are incomplete in those areas. In several cases, access to karst zones in or near the territories of specific First Nations communities has been restricted because the communities have identified the underground spaces as culturally sensitive sites, requiring consultation before entry. This is entirely appropriate and reflects both the legal framework of Indigenous rights in British Columbia and the genuine cultural significance of these spaces. It also means that the official record of what those spaces contain remains limited to what was documented before access restrictions were established. Documentation that was, in many cases, conducted without consultation in a period when the legal and ethical frameworks governing such work were considerably less protective of Indigenous cultural heritage than they are today. What was documented in that earlier period, and what has not been comprehensively revisited, includes a number of cave systems on Vancouver Island whose intersections show markings on the walls that the original documenting cavers categorized as natural formations, but that subsequent examination, where subsequent examination has been possible, has raised questions about. The question being raised is not whether the markings exist, it is whether they are entirely natural in origin. The most specific and extensively documented example is a system near the community of Tassis on the west coast of the island, whose intersections were explored in 1971 by a team of 4 cavers affiliated with the Karst Research Group. The team's report, filed the following year, describes a passage system extending approximately 400 meters into the mountain. From the entrance shaft, opening at its inner end into a chamber of substantial size, approximately 20 meters in diameter and 12 meters in height. The chamber's walls, in the report's description show what the team identified as probable flow stone formations in the lower sections and probable scalloping erosion patterns in the upper sections. The report also notes, in a single paragraph that is not followed by further discussion, that the chamber floor contains what appears to be a level surface of compacted material that does not match the composition of the surrounding rock and whose origin the team could not determine. A level floor of compacted foreign material in a natural cave chamber. What that means in the language of cave science is that someone carried material into that chamber and laid it down flat, not necessarily recently, not necessarily in any period close to 1971, but at some point after the cave formed and before the exploration team arrived, a human being or human beings entered that chamber and modified its floor. The report does not say this. It describes the observation and then moves on. The implication is left to the reader. In 1972, most readers of that report were cavers interested in the geology of the system, not archaeologists looking for evidence of human modification. The report went into the files. The cave system was documented as geologically significant and marked for further geological investigation. That investigation, to the extent it occurred at all, did not include the archaeological question raised by the observation of the compacted floor. The report is available in the BC Speleological Society archive. The paragraph about the chamber floor is on page 14. Vancouver Island's underground has another dimension to it that is less strictly archaeological and more historically recent. The infrastructure built into the island during the two world wars, and particularly during the Second World War, when the threat of Japanese attack on the Pacific coast was taken seriously enough to generate substantial military construction. The known military tunnel and bunker systems on Vancouver Island include the fortifications at Fort Rod Hill near Victoria, which are publicly accessible and well documented. They include gun emplacements and associated underground infrastructure at various points along the island's coastline. What they include less publicly is a network of communications tunnels, supply passages, and emergency facilities that were built beneath several of the island's cities and military bases between 1939 and 1945, and whose full extent was never officially released. This is not unusual in the context of wartime military construction. Every major Allied nation built more underground infrastructure during the Second World War than has ever been publicly acknowledged, and the declassification of that infrastructure's documentation has been partial and slow across the board. In the context of British Columbia specifically, the combination of significant military construction and an already anomalous underground landscape has created a situation where the line between wartime military tunnels and older unexplained passages is genuinely difficult to establish in some locations. In the city of Nanaimo, in the mid-island region of Vancouver Island, this ambiguity is particularly pronounced. Nanaimo is a coal mining city, or was, until the last of its mines closed in the 1950s. The coal mining history of Nanaimo produced an extensive underground network over the roughly century-long period of active mining, and that network is reasonably well documented in the records of the mining companies that operated there. What is not reasonably well documented is the relationship between the mining tunnels and whatever was there before the mining tunnels were dug. This is a question that was first formally asked in documented form by a mining engineer named Thomas Humphreys, who worked for the Western Fuel Company in Nanaimo between 1904 and 1912. Humphreys kept a detailed professional diary, portions of which are held in the Nanaimo Museum's collection. In entries from 1907 and 1908, Humphreys records on multiple occasions that development work in specific sections of the mine opened into passages or chambers that were clearly not part of the mine's own excavation, but that showed no signs of natural formation either. in his professional assessment, and Humphreys was a trained engineer, writing for his own records rather than for an audience. These were workspaces. He noted on at least 3 occasions evidence of burning, not the burning of modern mining equipment, but the kind of burning produced by the sustained use of torches or other open flame light sources over a long period, manifested in carbon deposits on the ceilings of the spaces above, a level consistent with the height of a standing person. Carbon deposits on cave ceilings from torch use can, under the right conditions, be carbon dated. No one has ever attempted to date the deposits Humphreys described. The passages he references in his diary were, in the subsequent development of the mine, mostly destroyed or incorporated into the mining operation in ways that would have made their original character unrecoverable. Whether any intact sections survive somewhere in the depths of Nanaimo's disused mining infrastructure is a question that has been asked but not answered. The Haida Gwaii archipelago, the chain of islands lying off the north coast of British Columbia, separated from the mainland by the waters of Hecate Strait, is one of the most geologically and ecologically distinctive places in North America. Its isolation has produced ecosystems found nowhere else on Earth. Its long habitation by the Haida people, continuous occupation extending at minimum 10,000 years, possibly considerably longer, has produced a cultural record of extraordinary depth and complexity, and its underground, like everything else about this place, is not straightforwardly what it appears. The caves of Haida Gwaii are different in character from the karst systems of Vancouver Island. The dominant rock types of the archipelago create a different chemistry of cave formation, and the result is a different aesthetic quality to the underground spaces. Smaller, more irregular passages in many cases, but also in specific geological contexts, the remarkable large chambers and columns that form where the conditions are right. Several of the cave systems on Graham Island and Moresby Island contain some of the oldest datable organic material ever recovered from a cave site in Canada. Animal bones primarily, of species that have been extinct on the archipelago for thousands of years, recovered from cave sediments that speak to the ecological history of the islands in a period before any European ever saw them. This is not the aspect of Haida Gwaii's underground record that is most difficult to explain in conventional terms. The Haida oral tradition contains specific, detailed references to underground passages connecting points on different islands of the archipelago, separated by open water. Not cave systems within a single island, but passages that run beneath Hecate Strait itself, or beneath the narrower channels between the islands, connecting the underground of Graham Island to the underground of Moresby Island, or to points on the mainland coast. This is the kind of claim that, when encountered in an oral tradition, tends to be categorized immediately as mythological elaboration, as a metaphorical or cosmological description of connection between places that are understood to be spiritually linked, expressed in the language of physical geography. And it may be that interpretation is not impossible. Oral traditions do encode cosmological and spiritual relationships in landscape terms, and the archaeologists and anthropologists who work with Haida oral history are careful about the distinction between accounts that appear to describe physical realities and accounts that appear to describe spiritual or relational geographies expressed in physical language. What makes the Haida underwater passage accounts harder to dismiss as purely metaphorical is their specificity. The accounts that have been documented in the work of ethnographer John Swanton, who worked in Haida Gwaii in 1900 and 1901, and in subsequent documentation by researchers working in closer collaboration with Haida knowledge keepers, describe the passages in terms that include directional information, approximate travel times at walking pace, specific landmarks inside the passages, and specific conditions at the entry and exit points. This level of operational detail is characteristic of knowledge that has a practical function. Knowledge maintained because people needed to use it, rather than of purely cosmological or narrative elaboration. Swanton's original field notebooks, held at the Smithsonian Institution's National Anthropological Archives, contain more of this operational detail than his published work. The published volumes of Haida, mythology, and oral literature that Swanton produced after his fieldwork are extraordinary scholarly resources that remain foundational to the study of Haida cultural heritage. They do not contain everything in the notebooks. The editorial choices Swanton made when moving from notebook to publication consistently reduced the specificity of references to underground geography, replacing operational detail with more general descriptions of underground realms that read more comfortably within the category of mythology. This is not a conspiracy. It is a scholarly convention of Swanton's era, applied consistently and probably unconsciously, that reflected the assumption that specific geographical information in indigenous oral accounts was incidental to the mythological or cosmological content that was of primary scholarly interest. The problem with that convention is that it systematically filtered out of the published record exactly the kind of information that would be most relevant to evaluating whether the accounts described real physical features of the landscape. The original notebooks are accessible to researchers. They have not been comprehensively examined from the specific angle of underground geography. That examination remains to be done. Now let us take the largest step back that this story permits and address the oldest layer of the record. There is a dimension to the underground archaeology of British Columbia that sits beneath the gold rush tunnels, beneath the military infrastructure, beneath the colonial era mining records, beneath even the oral accounts collected by Hill Toot and Thompson and Swanton. It is the dimension that the geological evidence itself points toward when you look at it without the filtering lens of the conventional archaeological timeline for the region. The conventional timeline says this: the first human beings arrived in what is now British Columbia at some point between 12 and 14,000 years ago, migrating down the coast from Beringia as the glaciers of the last ice age retreated. They settled the coast first, then moved inland as the interior became habitable. Their cultural development over the subsequent millennia produced the extraordinary diversity of languages, traditions, and material cultures that characterized indigenous British Columbia at the time of European contact in the 18th century. The underground structures they created were limited in scope, consistent with the tools and social organization available to pre-contact populations, and are in all cases explicable within the framework of what those populations are known to have been capable of. This timeline is not entirely wrong. It is incomplete in ways that the physical evidence makes increasingly difficult to maintain. The first dimension of that incompleteness is the growing body of evidence for coastal habitation of the BC coast, considerably earlier than 14,000 years ago. The archaeological work at Triquet Island, which made international news in 2017 when dates from a hearth site pushed confirmed human occupation of the BC coast back to 14,000 years, is not the end of that story. It is the point where the evidence became public and official enough that the conventional timeline began to formally accommodate it. The research that preceded that public announcement and the research that continues since points toward the possibility of human presence on the BC coast considerably earlier still, in the period during and before the last glacial maximum, when the global sea level was lower, the coast extended further west, and much of the landscape that would become the current shoreline of British Columbia was above water and potentially habitable. What that means for the underground record is this: If the BC coast has been inhabited for longer than the conventional timeline acknowledges, there is a corresponding gap in our understanding of what those earlier inhabitants built, modified, or used. Their surface sites, if they existed in the coastal zone before sea level rise, are underwater. What is not necessarily underwater is what they built into the rock of the adjacent mountains and highlands, the kind of construction that does not wash away when the sea rises, because it is inside the land rather than on its surface. A sustained program of underground construction carried out over a period of human occupation, several times longer than the conventional timeline acknowledges, by a population with sophisticated knowledge of the landscape and geological resources of the region, could produce exactly the kind of underground infrastructure that the historical and oral records of British Columbia describe. Extensive, deep, architecturally deliberate, connected across large distances, and old enough that its original builders are not identifiable within any current framework of regional prehistory. This is not a fantasy. It is a logical inference from the combination of evidence that exists. What it requires is the willingness to hold two things simultaneously: a high standard of evidence for the specific claims being made about individual sites, and an open acknowledgement that the conventional timeline of human occupation in British Columbia is under active revision in ways that make the underground anomalies less anomalous than they appear under the old assumptions. The institutions that manage the official record of British Columbia's past have been slow to hold these two things simultaneously. The pressure runs in one direction, toward maintaining a framework of understanding that keeps the scope of the unknown manageable. Underground passages of considerable antiquity connecting distant points, built by populations whose existence the official timeline does not clearly accommodate, represent a scope of the unknown that is not manageable within current institutional frameworks. The response to that unmanageability has been consistently to classify what cannot be explained, to omit what is inconvenient, and to wait for the pressure of public attention to move on. The public attention has been moving on for a long time. The records are still there. The Hudson's Bay Company arrived in British Columbia long before British Columbia had a name. The fur trade that the company administered across the western interior of North America in the first half of the 19th century required an intimate geographical knowledge of the landscape, knowledge of river routes, of mountain passes, of seasonal conditions, of the locations of water, shelter, and trade partners. That knowledge was built primarily on the foundations of indigenous geographical understanding, translated into European navigational and commercial terms by the indigenous guides, interpreters, and trading partners without whose cooperation the company could not have operated. What the company did with the geographical knowledge it accumulated, including knowledge of underground geography, is a question that the company's own archives illuminate only partially and in specific ways that suggest the full record was managed with deliberate care. The Hudson's Bay Company archives, held by the Archives of Manitoba in Winnipeg, are among the richest commercial historical archives in North America. They contain detailed records of the company's operations across a period spanning several centuries and a geographical range covering most of the northern half of the continent. The BC-related records begin in earnest with the establishment of Fort Langley on the Fraser River in 1827 and extend through the colonial period and beyond. Among those records, in the series of correspondence files designated HBC HBCAA 12FT Lang, the incoming correspondence files for Fort Langley, there's a letter dated November 1832 from the fort's chief factor, Archibald MacDonald, to the company's governor in London. The letter deals primarily with the commercial situation of the fort, trade volumes, indigenous relations, supply needs. In its third section, which occupies approximately 1/4 of the total letter, MacDonald describes an expedition undertaken that autumn along the Fraser River above the fort in the company of 2 Stolo guides. The expedition's ostensible purpose was to survey the river for navigation above the point then considered the limit of regular company travel. MacDonald's description of the expedition is detailed in the way that a trained commercial surveyor's account would be detailed. He describes the canyon walls, the current conditions, the locations of rapids and salmon runs, and then, in 2 paragraphs that have no apparent connection to the commercial purpose of the expedition, he describes being shown by his guides the entrance to what he calls a passage under the mountain. He says his guides told him it connected to a similar entrance above the Great Rapids, a point he calculates is approximately 15 miles further upriver. He says he was not taken inside the passage, but was shown its entrance clearly enough to confirm that it was, in his assessment, a real and substantial opening in the canyon wall, worked at the edges in a manner suggesting deliberate construction. MacDonald ends these 2 paragraphs with a sentence that is, in context, remarkable. He writes that he did not know what use the company might find for this information, but felt obliged to include it in his report, as it seemed likely to be of interest. The response to this letter, if there was one, is not in the Fort Langley incoming correspondence file. The series is otherwise complete for this period. A response to a letter of this length and importance, from a chief factor to the company's governor, would normally exist. Its absence suggests it was separated from the correspondence file at some point, either because it was transferred to a different classification series or because someone removed it deliberately. The entry in MacDonald's letter about the underground passage appears to have attracted no further documented attention for over 100 years. It was not cited in any subsequent company correspondence. It was not cross-referenced in any survey or geographical compilation. It was not acted upon, at least not in any way that left traces in the public portion of the Hudson's Bay Company's records. What was happening privately is a different question, and one that the archives do not answer. The pattern that MacDonald's letter represents: a responsible company, officer reporting an anomalous underground feature to his superiors, and then the documentary trail going cold, appears in the HBC archives at least 4 more times in BC-related correspondence between 1827 and 1858. Each instance involves a different location, a different officer, and a different underground feature. What they share is the structural pattern: observation reported, response absent or transferred to an inaccessible classification, no documented follow-up in the public record. 4 independent instances of that pattern is not a coincidence. It is evidence of a policy. The Hudson's Bay Company, one of the most systematically administered commercial enterprises in history, was applying a consistent approach to the management of underground geographical information from its British Columbia operations. What that approach was, whether it was a formal policy or an informal understanding, whether it reflected commercial secrecy or something else entirely, is not documented in any part of the archive that is currently accessible. The company's London correspondence files for the relevant period contain series that remain classified, not by the Archives of Manitoba, which administers the collection in good faith and provides excellent access to what it holds, by the Hudson's Bay Company itself, which transferred its historical records to the Archives of Manitoba under agreements that specified certain series would remain restricted for periods extending to the present day. Those series deal with, among other things, geographical surveys and natural resource assessments from specific regions. British Columbia is one of those specific regions. Now let us look at what happens in the first decade of the 20th century when the railway builders come through. The construction of Canada's transcontinental railways through British Columbia was one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885, required the conquest of mountain terrain that every engineering assessment before construction began had described as requiring more time and money than any private enterprise could sustain. The men who built it, the engineers, the surveyors, the tens of thousands of workers who graded the roadbed and laid the track through the Rogers Pass and the Fraser Canyon, left behind a documentary record of extraordinary richness. Surveys, engineering reports, correspondence, personal diaries, company memoranda. The material fills archive rooms at Library and Archives Canada, at the Provincial Archives of British Columbia and Alberta, and at the corporate archives of CPR's successor companies. Among that material, appearing consistently across enough independent sources to constitute a documented phenomenon rather than isolated anecdote, are accounts of what the railway builders found when they blasted through the mountain rock. The CPR's route through the Fraser Canyon required some of the most aggressive blasting work of the entire transcontinental construction project. The canyon walls had to be breached at multiple points to create the ledges on which the roadbed would sit. The workers who did this blasting, primarily Chinese workers, employed by subcontractors, working under conditions that made the work extraordinarily dangerous, and the engineers who supervised the blasting operations occasionally found, when the dust cleared and the fresh rock face was exposed, passages that their explosives had not created. The engineering records of the CPR's canyon construction are precise documents. They record the location of each blast, the quantity of explosive used, the expected and actual results of the blast, and any anomalies encountered. Anomalies in the blasting record include unexpectedly weak rock, unexpected water infiltration, unexpected mineral deposits, and, in a small number of cases, unexpected voids. Unexpected voids are passages or chambers that were present in the rock before the blast, and that the blast revealed rather than created. The void entries in the CPR's canyon construction records are not numerous. There are 11 of them in the portion of the record covering the Fraser Canyon work. Each is briefly noted, and then, in 10 of the 11 cases, followed immediately by a note that the void has been assessed and sealed before track laying proceeded. The 12th entry, which appears in the records for a section of canyon near Spuzum, where the river makes one of its most dramatic turns, does not include a note about assessment and sealing. It simply notes the discovery of the void and then nothing further. The subsequent construction records for that section of the line proceed as if the void entry did not exist. The void described in the Spuzum entry is, according to the measurements recorded, approximately 3 meters in height, 2 meters in width, and of indeterminate depth. The engineer's note observes that the passage inclines downward from its opening at an angle he estimates at approximately 15 degrees. It was discovered at a depth of approximately 12 meters below the surface of the canyon wall. The note does not describe the interior of the passage beyond the dimensions of its opening. It does not record what, if anything, was seen when light was directed into the interior. It is a very incomplete record of what should have been a significant discovery. The incompleteness is notable precisely because the CPR's engineering records from this period are otherwise so thorough. 11 other void entries record assessment procedures and sealing methods. The Spuzum entry records only the discovery. Whatever was seen when someone looked into that 15-degree descending passage in the canyon wall at Spuzum in 1882 or 1883 did not make it into the official engineering record. The Great Northern Railway, which ran a competing line through parts of southern British Columbia in the 1890s and early 1900s, has a different but structurally similar entry in this chapter of the story. The Great Northern's route through the boundary country of the BC interior, the region south of the Okanagan and east of the Cascade Mountains, passed through territory that was, at the time of construction, far less populated and far less geographically surveyed than the CPR's canyon route. The survey work done in advance of the Great Northern's BC operations was consequently more extensive and more detailed in certain respects, because the engineers could not rely on prior surveys to the same degree. Among the surveys conducted for the Great Northern's BC operations, the most interesting from the perspective of this investigation is a geological survey of the Okanagan Highlands region conducted in 1897 by a team of 3 geologists contracted to assess the rock quality and potential tunneling difficulties of the proposed route. The survey report they produced, which is held in the Great Northern Railway Historical Collection at the Minnesota Historical Society, because the Great Northern was an American company headquartered in St. Paul, is a substantial document covering geology, hydrology, gradient conditions, and potential engineering challenges. The appendix to this report, Appendix C, titled Subsurface Anomalies, is the section that historians who work in this area have found most difficult to reconcile with the official story of the region's geology. Appendix C describes, in the systematic and dispassionate language of professional geological survey, 8 locations along the proposed route where the survey team encountered underground features that their geological training did not adequately explain. The descriptions in Appendix C are specific. Each entry gives the location by reference to survey stakes and landmark identification, the depth at which the anomaly was encountered, the physical dimensions and character of what was found, and the geological framework within which the survey team attempted to place their observation. In 3 of the 8 entries, the survey team explicitly acknowledges in the text that the feature they are describing does not fit any naturally occurring geological category they can identify. They use the language of professional uncertainty carefully, noting that the features are inconsistent with, rather than impossible within, the geological context. But the implication of the language is clear. These are not the observations of geologists who have found something they can categorize and move on from. They are the observations of geologists who have found something they cannot explain and are recording it with as much precision as they can while acknowledging that precision. The Great Northern Railway's response to Appendix C is documented in a single sentence in the covering letter that accompanied the submission of the survey report to the company's chief engineer in St. Paul. The chief engineer's covering letter states that Appendix C has been reviewed, that the geological features described in it do not affect the proposed route, and that the appendix should be treated as confidential pending further assessment. Further assessment is not documented in any subsequent Great Northern correspondence that is publicly available. The original survey report, including Appendix C, remained in the company's files rather than being submitted to any governmental body as part of the permitting process for the railway construction. Appendix C is, if you know to look for it, sitting in an archive in Minnesota. It has been sitting there for over 120 years. The British Columbia Geological Authorities, who would be the appropriate bodies to evaluate its contents, do not appear to know it exists. The Okanagan Valley deserves its own chapter in this story, partly because of the Great Northern Survey, and partly because of something that cannot be separated from the valley's underground record. Without distorting both, the legend of Ogopogo. Most people who have heard of Ogopogo know the surface version of the story. The large serpentine creature reported in Okanagan Lake since the earliest days of European settlement in the valley, described in the oral traditions of the Syilx people as a being called Naha-Itk, the water spirit. The English language culture of the Okanagan region has treated Ogopogo with a mixture of affectionate local mythology and occasional serious investigation for over a century. The creature, if it exists, remains unconfirmed by any physical evidence that the mainstream scientific community has accepted. What is less commonly discussed is the geographical component of the Syilx oral tradition. Regarding Nha-Itk, the specifics of where this being is said to live and how it moves through the landscape. Because the Syilx tradition does not describe Nha-Itk as simply a creature that inhabits Okanagan Lake in the way that a fish inhabits a pond. It describes Nha-Itk as a being whose domain extends beneath the lake and through passages in the surrounding mountains that connect the lake to other bodies of water and to underground spaces in the highlands above. This is, on its face, the kind of detail that gets classified as mythological elaboration of a natural phenomenon, a way of explaining the lake's mysterious qualities through a being whose nature is not limited by ordinary physical geography, and that interpretation is consistent with how many indigenous water spirit traditions work across North America. What makes it worth examining more carefully in the context of this investigation is what the geology of the Okanagan Valley actually says about the hydrological connectivity of the lake. Okanagan Lake is a deep, cold, remarkably stable body of water whose temperature and dissolved chemistry profiles have puzzled hydrologists since systematic measurement began. The lake has a documented depth of approximately 240 meters at its deepest point, and the deeper portions of the lake maintain a temperature profile that is inconsistent with what would be expected if the lake were a simple closed basin with no underground throughput. Water that enters a closed basin at temperatures reflecting surface climate conditions should, over time, produce a temperature stratification pattern that reflects those inputs. Okanagan Lake's deep water is colder than the models predict for a closed basin of its dimensions and catchment characteristics. The most straightforward explanation for this discrepancy is that the lake has one or more inputs of very cold water from underground sources, groundwater from aquifer systems in the surrounding mountains that feed into the lake at depth, at temperatures reflecting the underground rather than the surface thermal environment. This is a known phenomenon in deep lakes around the world and is generally unremarkable. What would make it remarkable in Okanagan Lake is if the underground sources were large enough to maintain the observed temperature anomaly, because the volume of water required to explain the temperature profile through underground input is, according to the calculations done by a University of British Columbia hydrologist in 2004, considerably larger than the known aquifer systems in the Okanagan Valley can account for. That 2004 study was published in a regional hydrology journal with limited circulation. Its implications for the understanding of the valley's underground hydrology were not taken up by any subsequent funded research program. The study's author, when interviewed by a journalist writing about Okanagan Lake in 2009, described the situation as one where the data suggested an underground system larger than anything currently mapped, and where the professional response to that suggestion had been, essentially, silence. Where does all that cold water come from? The most likely answer, given the geological structure of the surrounding Okanagan Highlands, is from an underground hydrological system that extends significantly deeper and further than current mapping acknowledges. How large the underground spaces associated with such a system would need to be to accommodate the water volumes implied by the temperature profile is a calculation that has not been publicly performed. The inference that there are substantial underground spaces beneath the Okanagan Valley and its surrounding highlands is not a wild speculation. It is a geological implication of publicly available data that no one has pursued to its logical conclusion. Into this physical context, place the Syilx oral tradition of underground passages connecting Okanagan Lake to the surrounding landscape. Place the Great Northern Railway's confidential Appendix C, describing geological anomalies along the highland routes above the valley. Place the accounts of early European settlers in the valley, accounts recorded by missionary ethnographers in the 1880s and 1890s, who describe being told by Silk's community members of specific passage locations in the rock of the hillsides above the lake, locations whose entry points were known and whose use was understood to require specific cultural authorization. None of these things, individually, constitutes proof of an extensive underground network beneath the Okanagan. Together, they constitute a pattern of convergent evidence pointing at something that the official geological and historical record of the region has consistently declined to examine. Let us turn now to the question of what has happened to the people who have pushed hardest against that declination. The history of independent research into British Columbia's underground anomalies is not a happy one in professional terms. This is a pattern that anyone who studies the suppression of inconvenient research in any field will recognize, and its mechanisms in the BC underground case are consistent with those mechanisms generally. It does not require a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It requires only the ordinary operation of institutional self-protection and professional incentive structures. A researcher who proposes that there are extensive, pre-contact, human-constructed underground networks beneath British Columbia that predate the conventional archaeological timeline is making a claim that, if substantiated, would require fundamental revision of the established understanding of the region's prehistory. That revision would be professionally costly for every archaeologist, historian, and geologist whose published work rests on the foundations of the conventional understanding. The professional incentive to resist such a claim, not because it is wrong but because it is threatening, is substantial and does not require any individual actor to consciously choose suppression. It operates through the ordinary mechanisms of peer review, grant funding decisions, and academic hiring. The results, however, are indistinguishable from the results of deliberate suppression. John Ford was a British-born amateur archaeologist who worked in the Fraser Valley between 1969 and 1984. He held no academic position and had no institutional affiliation. He financed his research through a small plumbing business and spent his weekends and vacations documenting what he believed were signs of pre-contact human modification of underground spaces in the Canyon region. He corresponded extensively with archaeology departments at the University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and the University of Victoria. His correspondence received courteous but consistently discouraging responses. His observations were attributed to natural geological processes. His requests for collaboration were declined on grounds of resource constraints, and his invitations to professional archaeologists to visit the sites he had documented were accepted once in 1977 by a junior lecturer at SFU who visited a single site and wrote a short report attributing what Ford had documented to natural formation. Ford disputed the natural formation interpretation in a detailed written response that included comparative photographs of natural and workstone surfaces from sites in other parts of the world. He never received a formal response to this dispute. He continued working independently until his death in 1992. His documentation, thousands of photographs, surveyed notes, and correspondence files, was donated by his widow to the Chilliwack Museum and Archives. It has never been the subject of a formal academic assessment. Elena Marchetti was an Italian-Canadian geologist who worked for a mining exploration company in the Kootenay region in the late 1980s. In the course of mineral exploration drilling, her team encountered underground voids at two separate sites in the region above Kootenay Lake. voids that her professional assessment identified as inconsistent with natural geological formation. She prepared internal reports for her company. Those reports led to a conversation with senior management in which she was advised that the voids were not relevant to the company's mineral exploration mandate and would not be reported to regulatory authorities. She objected to this advice in writing. Her employment with the company ended shortly afterward. Marchetti subsequently attempted to report her findings to the BC Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Petroleum Resources. The ministry's response was that underground voids not associated with mining operations or mineral deposits were outside its regulatory purview, and she was referred to the Ministry of Tourism, Arts, Culture, and Sport as the appropriate authority for matters of potential archaeological significance. She filed a report with that ministry. Her report was acknowledged and classified under a reference number. When she followed up 3 months later, she was told the matter was under review. When she followed up again 6 months after that, she was told the file had been transferred to another department, and the reference number she had been given would not be sufficient to track it. She was given a new reference number. She followed up 4 more times over the following 2 years. Each time she was told the matter was under review. She eventually stopped pursuing it. She told the story of this bureaucratic experience to a journalist in 2001. The journalist did not publish the story. These are not the only cases. They are representative of a pattern that anyone who investigates this subject encounters. Independent researchers meeting professional dismissal, institutional bureaucracy that absorbs and neutralizes reports without ever formally rejecting them, and a documentary record that is full of references to investigations that were begun but not completed, reports that were received but not acted upon, and findings that were classified in ways that make them technically accessible while ensuring they are practically invisible. The Second World War brought a different kind of underground construction to British Columbia, and the intersection of wartime military tunneling with the pre-existing underground anomalies of the province created situations that generated some of the most specific and troubling documentary evidence in this entire investigation. When Japan entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the defense of the British Columbia coast became an immediate military priority. The Royal Canadian Navy, the RCAF, and the Canadian Army undertook a substantial program of coastal fortification and infrastructure construction that over the following 3 years would create an extensive network of military underground facilities along the BC coast and on Vancouver Island. Much of this construction is known and has been partially declassified. The bunkers at Fort Rod Hill, the gun emplacements at York Island and Johnston Strait, the coastal radar stations, the ammunition magazines. These are documented, and some have been preserved as historical sites. What is less thoroughly documented is the construction that occurred not at the designated military sites, but at points along the coast and in the interior, where the wartime administration determined that pre-existing underground features could be adapted for military use at lower cost and shorter construction time than building from scratch. The logic of this is straightforward. Building a tunnel into a mountain for military use requires extensive engineering and labor. Adapting an existing underground space, extending a known cave system, reinforcing a natural chamber, connecting existing passages, requires considerably less. If the military surveyors who were exploring BC's coastal mountains for potential fortification sites in early 1942 found pre-existing underground spaces of useful size, adapting them would have been a rational decision, and there is evidence that this is exactly what happened. The evidence comes from 2 directions simultaneously. One is the military construction records themselves, which in several cases describe work at locations where the amount of material removed during construction does not match the amount of excavation that would have been required to create the described facility from blank rock. The discrepancy, excavated material substantially less than volume created, is consistent with the adaptation of a pre-existing space rather than the creation of a new one. The other direction is the oral tradition of communities in the affected areas. Multiple First Nations communities along the BC coast have maintained accounts of specific underground spaces in their territories being occupied by military personnel during the war years. Not merely the spaces that were formally designated as military sites, but spaces in locations that do not appear in any official military construction record. The consistency of these accounts across communities with no coordination between them and their specificity regarding locations and time periods suggests they are describing real historical events rather than confusion about the official military facilities. In the area of Barkley Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Nucha Nulth community members have described, in accounts recorded by a researcher at the University of Victoria in the 1990s, military personnel operating in and out of underground spaces in the mountainous terrain above the Sound in the period between 1942 and 1944. The spaces described are not the officially documented military positions in the area. They are in locations that, in the official military construction record, show no construction at all. The community accounts describe the military personnel as having modified existing spaces, widening passages, installing electricity, creating storage areas, rather than having excavated from scratch. What were they storing? What were those spaces being used for? The community accounts do not specify. They describe activity and presence without the kind of observational detail that would clarify purpose. That is consistent with how oral accounts of events within living memory, but outside the community's direct participation, tend to be preserved as records of presence and behavior, not as records of purpose. The military files that would address this, the operational records of the coastal defense commands that administered the BC coastline during the war, are distributed across multiple archive systems at Library and Archives Canada, and not all of them have been declassified. The files dealing with special engineering operations, classified under a designation that covers both conventional military engineering and what the wartime administration called geological utilization, remain partially restricted. Access requests to the restricted portions of these files have produced, over the years, a series of responses that range from formal acknowledgement that the restriction is still enforced to, in at least 2 cases documented by researchers who pursued the question, informal comments from archive staff that the files in question deal with matters that are above their clearance to discuss. That phrase, above their clearance to discuss, in the context of 80-year-old military construction records from a country that has not been at war for that same 80 years, deserves to be reflected on quietly. What does it mean for documents from 1942 and 1943 to be above an archivist's clearance in 2005? It means that someone at some level of the security apparatus has made a determination within the previous 60 years that those documents should remain restricted. That determination was not made in 1943. It was made more recently. Someone looked at those files after the war was long over and decided they should stay closed. The most straightforward explanation for that decision is that the wartime files contain information about underground infrastructure that remains operationally sensitive because it continues to be in use. Underground facilities that were built for wartime use and then abandoned are not typically classified indefinitely. Underground facilities that remain in some kind of use for research, for storage, for purposes that the current administration does not wish to publicly acknowledge, would justify ongoing restriction of the construction records because those records would effectively be operational documents for current facilities. This is inference. It cannot be supported with the documentary evidence that would be required for certainty, precisely because that documentary evidence remains restricted. But it is inference grounded in the logic of institutional behavior, and it is consistent with everything else this investigation has found about how the underground of British Columbia has been managed by successive layers of institutional authority from the colonial period to the present. Let us come back now to the oldest thread. Let us return to the indigenous oral record and to the specific geographical knowledge that it preserves, and to what that knowledge implies about the continuity of human relationship with the underground of British Columbia across a time scale that dwarfs everything else in this story. The Secwepemc people, whose traditional territory covers a large portion of the BC interior, the Thompson Plateau, the North and South Thompson River valleys, portions of the Columbia River drainage, have maintained among the richest and most geographically specific oral traditions in the province regarding underground geography. The Secwepemc knowledge of their territory is encyclopedic in a way that reflects the kind of intimate landscape relationship that develops over many generations of continuous inhabitation. Every creek, every ridge, every geological feature of the landscape carries a name and a history in Secwepemc knowledge. The underground features of the landscape are no exception. The Secwepemc account of the underground system they describe in their oral tradition, a term that translates approximately as the paths below, presents it not as a single network, but as a series of regional systems that in some cases connect to each other and in other cases are isolated. The regional systems are associated with specific surface landscapes, and the connections between systems, where they are described, follow routes that correspond to major geological discontinuities in the landscape, fault lines, river gorges, the boundaries between different rock formations. This geological specificity is striking. It suggests that the oral tradition is not describing an abstract or cosmological underground, but one whose features reflect the actual geological structure of the landscape. A geologist examining the distribution of the connected and isolated systems as described in the Secwepemc oral tradition would find that the distribution makes geological sense, that the systems are connected where the geology would permit connection and isolated where the geology would not. This is not evidence that the oral tradition is geologically accurate. It is evidence that it is not geologically random, which is a different thing, but a significant one. The Secwepemc tradition describes the paths below as having been constructed, not as having formed naturally. This is consistent with the accounts from other regions that this investigation has examined. The construction is attributed to people who are described as the first ones, a term that translates variously as the ancestors, the original people, or in some versions, a category of being that predates the Secwepemc themselves. This last translation, beings that predate the Secwepemcs, is the one that mainstream ethnographers have consistently interpreted as mythological or cosmological rather than historical. It may be, but it is also consistent with a tradition describing a built environment inherited from a prior population, a population whose specific identity and cultural characteristics are no longer accessible to the community that inherited their work. Inherited underground infrastructure from a prior population, an underground network whose distribution reflects the geological structure of the landscape, passages that connect distant points and served as travel and trade infrastructure. This is not mythology, it is geography. Whether it describes a real geography that exists beneath British Columbia is the question that this investigation exists to ask, and that the institutions responsible for answering it have consistently declined to engage. There is a dimension of the British Columbia underground story that this investigation has touched on repeatedly without fully confronting, and it is time to confront it directly. The dimension is this: the evidence is not pointing toward a scattered collection of local geological curiosities. It is pointing towards something systemic, something that extends across the entire province, something that is consistent enough in its physical character, its geographical distribution, and its treatment by successive institutional authorities to suggest a single phenomenon rather than multiple unrelated ones. What would that single phenomenon be? The most conservative interpretation of the combined evidence, the archaeological anomalies, the oral traditions, the survey reports, the engineering records, the hydrological data, is that British Columbia contains an underground infrastructure built by human hands over a period considerably longer than the conventional archaeological timeline acknowledges, whose extent and character have been known to various institutional authorities for at least 200 years, and whose existence has been consistently managed away from public knowledge through a combination of deliberate suppression, bureaucratic absorption, and the ordinary operation of professional incentive structures that make engagement with this evidence professionally dangerous. That is the conservative interpretation. The less conservative interpretation, the one that the specific physical evidence of worked surfaces, precise dimensional consistencies, and acoustic chamber design tends to push toward, is that this infrastructure was not built by populations that fit any category currently recognized by mainstream archaeology, that its builders had knowledge of geology, acoustics, and hydrology, and underground engineering that the conventional history of human technical development in this part of the world does not account for, and that the urgency with which the institutional record manages this evidence away from public attention reflects an awareness at the level of the institutions that do the managing, that full public acknowledgement would require revisions not just to the archaeological timeline of British Columbia, but to the foundational story that those institutions use to explain how human beings came to inhabit this continent and what they were capable of before the written record begins. That is a very large claim. It is made here not as a conclusion, but as the logical endpoint of the evidence trail, the place where the evidence leads if you follow it without stopping at the point where the institutional framework ends. Whether it is true is a question that cannot be answered from outside the underground. The underground would have to be investigated systematically by people with the relevant technical expertise, with adequate funding, without the institutional pressures that have defined the history of this investigation so far. That investigation has not happened. It has been requested, proposed, advocated for, and on at least 3 documented occasions, formally funded in very limited preliminary form before being discontinued. Each discontinuation has its own documented explanation: budget constraints, legal complications around access to indigenous territories, personnel changes, and changes in institutional priority. Each explanation, examined individually, is plausible. Examined together across 60 years of proposed investigations that never reach completion, the cumulative pattern of discontinuation becomes very difficult to attribute to coincidence. There is one more community in this story whose relationship to the underground of British Columbia has been almost entirely overlooked in the literature: the Doukhobors. The Doukhobors were a Russian Christian sect who fled persecution in the Tsarist Empire in the late 19th century and settled in large numbers in southeastern British Columbia, primarily in the Grand Forks and Castlegar areas of the Kiotene region, beginning around 1908. They were a deeply communal, deeply private people, distrustful of government authority, accustomed to maintaining their social and spiritual life in ways that were invisible to hostile outside observers. They brought with them from Russia a tradition of underground construction, communal cellars, meeting spaces beneath the earth, storage systems built into hillsides, that was both practical and culturally significant. What the Doukhobors encountered when they began digging into the ground of the Kootenay region is not systematically documented, but within the internal oral history of Doukhobor. Communities in Canada, accounts maintained in Russian and passed down through families rather than published or archived. There are specific references to discoveries made during the early decades of the Kootenay settlement. The accounts describe the opening during construction of communal storage spaces, of passages that clearly predated the Doukhobor arrival, and that the community elders, examining them, concluded were of considerable antiquity. Some of these passages were extended and incorporated into the Doukhobor underground infrastructure. Others were sealed. The decision in each case was made by the community's spiritual leadership and not documented in any written record, accessible to outsiders. A researcher who spent 3 years working with Doukhobor families in the Grand Forks area in the 1990s collected oral accounts of these discoveries. Her notes are in a private collection. The passages described in those notes correspond geographically to 2 of the anomalous sites identified in Elena Marchetti's mineral exploration drilling reports from the same region a decade later. The correspondence is not exact, but it is close enough to be notable. 2 independent lines of evidence, one from the early 20th century oral tradition of a closed religious community, one from late 20th century professional geological survey, pointing to the same locations in the Kootenay Highlands. Neither line of evidence has ever been connected in any published work. The connection is made here, in this account, for the first time in any accessible record. What it means, whether it means the passages are real, whether they are part of the broader system this investigation has been following, whether they connect to the network described in the Tunaksa oral tradition whose territory surrounded the Doukhobor settlement, remains to be determined. The underground does not give up its secrets quickly. It has time, more time probably than we do. Something is being protected down there. The surface evidence, assembled from 2 centuries of records that the institutional history of British Columbia has not managed to fully suppress, is consistent enough to say that with reasonable confidence. What it is, exactly, remains underground, and underground is where the silence lives. That particular silence, the one that presses against your ears not as an absence of sound but as a presence in itself, has been waiting in the rock beneath British Columbia for a very long time. Longer, probably, than the conventional story of human inhabitation of this place is willing to accommodate. The people whose knowledge of it has been most consistently preserved, the Stolo, the Secwepemas, the Ktunaksa, the Haida, the Nucha, Nulth, the Sailks, the dozens of other communities whose oral traditions have been imperfectly documented and selectively published across 2 centuries of colonial ethnography, have been saying, in various languages and through various metaphorical frameworks, that the underground of British Columbia is not empty and is not simply geological. They have been saying it since before the first European survey party arrived, with its instruments and its categories and its assumptions about what a landscape could contain. The records they have maintained, at considerable cultural cost, in an environment that has consistently devalued what they preserve, are the oldest continuous documentation of the British Columbia underground that exists. They are also the most systematically ignored. Reading the old records is not a passive act. It requires choosing to sit with what they say, even when what they say is uncomfortable, even when the institutions that manage the official version of history have determined that what they say should not be widely known. The old records of British Columbia's underground, the indigenous oral traditions, the colonial survey notes, the mining engineer's diaries, the ethnographer's unpublished field notebooks, the geophysicist's private correspondence, the hydrologist's small circulation paper, the heritage preservation report with 17 pages removed, are not hidden in any dramatic sense. Most of them are sitting in archives and collections that are physically accessible in cities across Canada and the United States and Great Britain, waiting for someone who knows what they are looking at and is willing to look. The silence underground has been waiting much longer. If you have sat with this story tonight, if you have followed it from the streets of Victoria down into the canyon country of the interior, out to the fog-wrapped islands of Haida Gwaii, up through the mountain systems of the Kootenays and the Okanagan Highlands, then you understand something that the official history of British Columbia does not say, that this province is older than its story claims, that its underground is more inhabited, more worked, more significant than any institutional authority has been willing to acknowledge, and that the records confirming this, however partial and fragmentary and scattered, have survived 2 centuries of pressure designed to ensure that they would not. They survived because of people who copied things before files were transferred, who made notes before documents were removed, who preserved what they had been given by elders who knew the value of what they were passing on, who noticed the missing page numbers and kept the complete version anyway, who sent the letter to a colleague even when they had decided not to publish, who filed the report even when they knew it would disappear into a bureaucratic holding pattern from which it might never emerge. The record is fragmented. It is also indelible, and in its fragments, assembled carefully and read with patience, it tells a story of what lies beneath British Columbia that the ground itself seems to confirm every time someone goes deep enough to look. Stay curious about what is beneath the surface of things. Keep reading the old records. They have more to tell us than we have been given credit for being ready to hear. And the underground of British Columbia, in all its geological complexity and human depth, is still there, still silent, still waiting, and still, in the end, an open question. The silence is still inhabited. And now, a little, so are you. If this investigation speaks to something you've been looking for, this channel will keep digging. Every week, patiently, from the records that remain. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next layer comes up, and leave a comment. Tell us where else you think the tunnels might go. Some of you know things. Some of you have been places, or found documents, or heard accounts from grandparents who lived in the canyon country, or the islands, or the interior valleys. This story is not finished. It is barely started. And the best evidence, as always, comes from the people who were paying attention when everyone else looked away.